involved. So welcome back. This is our third webinar, and today we're going to focus on connecting with colleagues and community. And so for those of you who were with us last week or the week before, welcome back. For those of you who are new, this is the third one in a series of 3 webinars, and the first focused on contemplative practices and kind of understanding burnout and how we might address it. And the second one was focused on managing our workload. And so today we're going to talk more about the interpersonal issues related to burnout at work. And I think we have a poll. Did we put it up yet? Where we wanted to see if you had tried an action step from last week. If you could take a moment to let us know about that. And then if you feel like sharing, you could write in the chat box just briefly what it was you tried and how it worked, so people might get a sense of what some of the activities are that people might have found helpful from last week that they've been trying. And as a side note, can the poll still be going while I go back to my slides, or do we need to wait a moment for that?
Oh, we would actually have to switch our pods, so we would have to go back to the share to put your slides up, which would then take over the poll.
Okay, so we'll wait just a minute if people wanted to still complete the poll.
They can continue to type in the chat box, though. So.
Okay. All right, we'll go back to the slides. Great. Okay. So our plan for today, we'll start off with a refresher contemplative practice. So this will be another breathing exercise, kind of a guided imagery to help us put our stressors into perspective. So we'll do that next, and then we'll talk a little bit about the role of our colleagues in the community, more specifically interacting with our patrons and co-workers in burnout, and then talk about some specific strategies. And I've kind of broken those down into 3 different areas. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to put your own burnout prevention plan in place. So throughout our webinar, as with the other 2, we'll take some time to reflect a little bit and write down some ideas. And so if you have your toolkit handy, that's great. If not, you might want to just get a piece of paper so that you could sketch out some ideas. And again, all of our slides and the recordings of this and the toolkit will be available for you, so you'll be able to download new copies in the future too. Okay, so for our first contemplative practice, this is called Putting Stressors into Perspective, and we will start with our deep breathing, and then I'll kind of walk you through some imagery to think about as you're still focusing on your deep breathing. So if you could get into a comfortable position, and I guess I should remind you about the breathing in case you weren't on the other webinars. Our diaphragmatic breathing is where we're trying to breathe deeply into our lungs, and we do that by expanding our stomach outward as you breathe in, and then back into your spine as you breathe out. So you can feel your tummy expand and contract as you're breathing in deeply. So those are the types of deep breaths that we're going to want to be taking. Okay, so now you can get into your comfortable position, and you can close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that, or you can just use kind of a soft focus and relax your eyes. Take a few deep cleansing breaths, slowly breathing in, using your diaphragm. And breathing out all the way. Notice your breathing, how it sounds as you're inhaling and exhaling. You might notice how it feels against your nose or your mouth. Now, as you're breathing, bring to mind a stressful situation, maybe something that's a moderate stressor for you now. Notice how big it looks. If you can, try to determine its size and weight. You might imagine putting it in a box or wrapping it up in a ball. It might be large or it might be small. Imagine the room you're sitting in. Where is your stressor? How big is it? Take a deep breath and look at your stressor from a different perspective in time. What might your stressor look like a month from now? Take another deep breath and think about how big is your stressor a year from now? Imagine looking back at your stressor when you're ready to retire. How big is it then? And you might imagine at the end of your long life, looking back, how big is it now? So take another deep breath or two, and when you're ready, you can open your eyes and come back to the group. So this is a nice exercise to kind of help put things into perspective for you. You can also do it with a physical distance. So instead of imagining the timeline, you could imagine yourself being in another building or a different state or on top of a mountain or maybe even from the moon looking down to kind of think about, in the grand scheme of things, how important is this now? All right, so we'll switch over now into our new content for today and start to talk about the role of colleagues and community in burnout. And I bring us back to that first work and health study that we talked about in the first webinar that was done by APA. In addition to asking about activities, they asked about when people interact with different types of people, what is their average happiness rating, and then how often are we interacting with people. And so you can see from the survey that our least happy interactions are with our bosses. And then kind of in the middle are our clients or customers, patrons for many of us now, and our coworkers. And you'll see that on the right-hand side that we spend the most time with those groups, even though they're not at the happiest of our rating system. And when we looked at our own library data from Indiana, where many of you did the survey, we looked at the top sources of challenge, where you said in your open-ended questions, what were the biggest sources of stress or challenge at work? And the top ones were relationships with your supervisors, with coworkers, and with patrons. And kind of the fourth most common one was not feeling effective or not being able to complete things. And that was a lot of the focus last week, was on managing workload. So our biggest stressors are with the people we work with, but also when we asked you the greatest sources of joy, 2 of those 3 relationships made it on the top sources of joy. So working with patrons and coworkers were on the top 3. And when I was giving this talk last week, someone noticed that bosses didn't make the joy ratings. So, but we'll talk about some ways to think about that today too. So where is the breakdown? If our colleagues in our community are very important sources of joy for us, why are they also the biggest sources of stress or challenge? And I think 3 key areas we can think about. One is a sense of lack of civility or respect in the workplace. And we hear a lot about this on the news recently. But even before the election season, we have had a lot of research in organizational psychology in the past few years talking about the role of civility and respect in the workplace and how we might be able to do more in that area. I think a second big area that causes stress for people is avoiding crucial conversations. So discussions that might be challenging or difficult, people avoid having them. And so we'll talk about some skills in those areas that we can do. And the third one is really the lack of time, energy, or resources to invest in building relationships. And so we're so busy in our work days that we're often trying to just focus on managing our tasks and getting things done, and we aren't able to spend the time building community with the people we work with. So in the first area, we'll kind of focus on incivility in the workplace. And what is incivility? And it's really defined as low-intensity, deviant behavior, and from the psychology perspective, that just means outside of the norm. And it's ambiguous intent to harm someone. So it's not really clear that someone is doing it to be mean, but it is something that you notice, and you might say, well, that's strange, or you might say, how rude, when it happens. And in research, they tend to break it down into 3 main areas. One is interpersonal, so someone doesn't say hi to you, or you're waiting patiently in line and someone else cuts right in front of you. It's not clear that they mean to hurt you. Maybe they didn't see you or notice you there. So it's that ambiguous intent. The second one is cyber incivility. So on email, do people not reply to your emails, or do we send blunt or terse emails that might be interpreted as harmful or rude behavior? And the third one is really victimless incivility. So it's not towards a particular person, but maybe we're not refilling the coffee, or we leave paper on the floor and someone else has to take care of it. And all of these forms of civility are really different from aggression or bullying. In that case, the intent to harm someone is clear. But these types of behaviors can lead to situations of aggression or bullying, kind of a tit for tat, that you kind of pay back someone. So what role do we play in incivility? And last week we talked about the cognitive model of how a particular action doesn't automatically lead to a feeling, but it's our thoughts about that action that kind of play that middle interpretation role. And so here this builds on that cognitive model and really adds different layers of interpretation that happens. And so it's called the ladder of inference. And if you start at the bottom, that's where we have the observable data and experiences in our life. So it's as if a video recorder might be recording the experience around you. That's all the data that's observable. But our minds can't really process all of that data, and so we select data to pay attention to in our environment. So that's kind of the next rung of the ladder. And then based on what we observe, we add meanings to that. So that might be based on our own family upbringing, our own culture. You can interpret things differently based on your own personal sense of meaning that you bring. You might then make assumptions based on meaning that you have added, and then draw conclusions based on that. And those will lead to adopting beliefs about the way the world works, and then you might take actions on those beliefs. And this is kind of a circular process, so that once you start forming beliefs about the world, you then go back and select data that fulfills those things. So let's do an example at work. So say you're walking into the library, so observable data, you're on your way into the library. You notice, your selected data is your supervisor walks past without acknowledging you. You add meaning. You think, she's mad. You assume, it must be something I said. You conclude that she thinks I am too outspoken. And that leads you to believe she's not going to treat you fairly in your upcoming evaluation. And so a potential action you could take, start looking for a new job. So this is kind of extreme, but you can see how you can go up this ladder of inference pretty quickly based on just observing something and applying these layers of meaning to it. So what can we do about it? Well, you can question your assumptions and your conclusions. Is she really mad? Or maybe she was just preoccupied. Or even if she were mad, isn't necessarily that she's mad at you. So you've made an assumption that it was something you said. Maybe she's not even mad at you. And then you have concluded that being mad will make her rate you poorly on your evaluation, but maybe that conclusion is faulty. The other thing you can do is seek contrary data. So did you miss other things when you were selecting your data? Maybe she was on the phone, or maybe she had another conversation just prior to passing you, and you might remember seeing some other data in the environment. And the other thing you can do is check in with her. So when we get to crucial conversations, we can talk about how you might do that. So that ladder of inference, I think, can help us keep in mind that role that our own thoughts can play in escalating potentially neutral or ambiguous stimuli in different ways. So when we think about, well, how can we learn from that and deal with our incivility from patrons? And in the open-ended questions, some of the challenges were having people who were demanding or maybe not in the best mood when they were asking for help, getting frustrated. And so when some of these things happen, I think the first thing you can do is take one of your deep breaths. So just kind of remember to slow down, kind of start trying to initiate that relaxation response that we talked about in the first webinar. And then you want to try to get a different perspective. You can start seeking meaning in the data you're observing. And so going back to that ladder of inference, you might go back to those early low rungs and say, well, I noticed that you seem to be feeling very frustrated. Can you help me understand what's going on here? And so you're actually seeking meaning from the person rather than going on your own assumptions. And the other thing that I find personally helpful is when you're starting to see someone else as being frustrated, or you're starting to feel frustrated. So when things get tough, then turn to wonder. And that helps me think about, well, I wonder what might be going on for this person, and gives me a sense of potentially empathy rather than focusing on my own frustration or irritability. So wondering what might be going on with this person and helping seek more of that meaning. You might also want to check your place on the ladder. Have you made an assumption based on the behavior? So one example I think that came up is that when people get frustrated and they get angry, and then the person, we might think, oh, they think I don't know what I'm doing, and then that makes us feel angry back. But maybe we're making an assumption, and so we can check our place on the ladder and kind of move back down. Another tip that is helpful is focusing on the problem and trying to solve the problem itself instead of focusing on how it feels. And I learned this from my physical trainer. Once a week I go and we lift weights, and she's always saying, just focus on what you need to do, not how it feels. And that helps me kind of get through that difficult time. And then at last, if you're still struggling, you might need to just take a break from the situation and seek support. Excuse yourself and then go find a colleague or a supervisor or someone else who might be able to help you. And that can help with the patron issue. So then what do we do with incivility with our colleagues? And that's a little different in that we need to have good working relationships with our colleagues kind of at a different level than patrons. We see some patrons frequently, but the colleagues are the people that you work with day in and day out, and you want to make sure that you have an environment that feels good for all of you to work in. So you can do some of the same things we just talked about with patrons. But we also, I think, need to focus on creating a safe space and a positive culture where we work. So one way to do that is engage with civility ourselves. And there's a quote from Gandhi that gets put into a bumper sticker, be the change you want to see in the world. And apparently he didn't say exactly that. It was more like a paragraph. But the basic point is, if you want to be in a civil, respectful environment, then you also can act that way and start making the change. And one thing I came across recently, I was listening to a podcast about Google's program. They have a worker wellness program called Searching Inside Yourself. And they have hired a mindfulness expert and someone who is a Buddhist practitioner to help them develop this system. And one of the things they talked about is sending mindful emails so we can try to get rid of that cyber incivility. And what they recommend is that as you're writing your email that you think might be perceived in different ways or might be conveying difficult information for someone, you type your email, and then you take 3 deep cleansing breaths. And then you go back to your email and read it from the perspective of the person you are planning to send it to. And then after you do that, you might still choose to send the exact same email, or you might find that you might want to edit it a little bit. So I really like that. I thought that was kind of a nice way to remind us to just take a moment, take a few deep breaths, and then see, are we really conveying the message we want to convey? And then other ways that we can deal with incivility are to approach crucial conversations And then focus on building relationships and social support. And so those will be the next two areas that we focus on. Crucial conversations. So crucial conversations are when stakes are high, when the topic is important to people, when the opinions vary, and when there might be strong emotions involved. And this book is a really nice way to think about how we can deal with these types of conversations, not just at work, but in other aspects of our lives. And it's a very quick read. I think you could read it over a weekend. But in this book, they talk about the natural responses when we feel like we need to have one of these crucial conversations. Is that we either avoid it, and they call that silence, or we confront a person, and they call that violence. So those are kind of our tendencies to either be quiet about it or confront someone. And their focus is really that there's a third way, and that's through dialogue. And they talk about ways that you can start those conversations. And the first step is really starting with heart. That's their language that they use. And that is reminding us to think about what is it I really want to get out of this conversation? Do I want to just win an argument, or is there some end goal that we really would like to have? And then when you're having the conversation, we need to be focused on identifying when people feel threatened, either when you feel threatened or when the other person feels threatened. You might see signals like eye rolling or deep sighing, those kind of things where it's clear that the emotions are getting in the way of having a good conversation. And so when that happens, you have to bring it back to the mutual purpose. What is it we both want to get out of this? And trying to go back to conveying respect to the other person. And as we were talking, I'm just reminded I didn't let you know on the toolkit on page 15, there's a place where you can write some kind of notes and things about this stuff. Anyway, sorry about that. In the Crucial Conversations books, they talk about how you might have this conversation with people. And it ties back into our ladder of inference as well, that you want to start by sharing your facts. And that's kind of that second rung on the ladder. What was it that you observed? So you might start off by saying, I noticed that, whatever it was that you wanted to share. And then next you tell your story. And your story is, what meaning did you ascribe to that observation? So I noticed this happening, so I thought maybe, and then you want to ask for the other person's ideas. So these first three aspects are letting you know what should go in your conversation. And the last two aspects are letting you know how you should have the conversation. And they really recommend talking tentatively so that we're trying to explore what your meaning is and what the other person's meaning of the situation might be, and encourage testing, and that is just testing our assumptions, our conclusions, by encouraging them. So if say you're in a staff meeting and someone is on their phone and not really paying attention during the discussion, and you have thought, oh, that person really doesn't care about what we're doing, and you're feeling upset about that, maybe your crucial conversation would start by saying, I noticed that in this meeting you were on your phone a lot, so I thought maybe that meant you really weren't engaged in what we're doing, or maybe you don't agree with the direction we're taking. Did I get this right? And then that allows the person to be able to share with you, maybe that is true, and then we can talk about how we can still work together on a particular project, or maybe they have different ideas about the project. Or maybe our assumptions were wrong and the person was really had some emergency at home and needed to check on their phone and make sure that things were okay. So it allows you to just check those assumptions and start an open conversation. So I wanted to go back to our ladder example earlier, where our supervisor has walked past us. We've decided that she is mad, and she's mad at me because she thinks it's something I said and that I'm too outspoken. So take a minute and think about, how would you approach this conversation with your supervisor? And you might remember what the Crucial Conversations book tells us. So you might try to find a quiet time later in the day when your supervisor is alone, and you could share your feelings and your facts of the story and say, I noticed this morning that you walked by and didn't say hi, and I thought maybe you were mad at me, or I had said something to offend you. Did I get that right? And then that might open a conversation. And again, it might have had nothing to do with you. Or if it does, she might be able to share in a safe way something that she does feel concerned about. So these kind of conversations should happen more individually. So if you want to have a crucial conversation, you need to think about the timing. Am I in a good place? Have I recognized what I want to get out of the conversation before you start those conversations, and having it at a place and time that seems appropriate. So in the middle of a staff meeting, you're not going to want to identify one particular person you need to have a crucial conversation with. But you can use some of the language in public settings as well, being tentative and sharing your observations and asking for other feedback. So the next section is on building relationships and social support. This is one of my favorite quotes attributed to Abraham Lincoln. I don't like that man, I must get to know him better. And he is really well known for bringing people who had opposing views close to him to help guide his administration. So we can think about relationship building at work, and that we really do need to invest in relationships outside of these crucial conversations or conflict at work. And you will find that as you have better relationships with people at work, or you know them as individuals, not just their role, but you know a little bit about them as a person, you can start having these conversations much easier. So some ideas that you might think about, trying to look for a common ground, things that you might share in common, and you might do that by asking the person to have lunch or talking to them over coffee breaks. If you're a manager or supervisor, you might consider ways that you can do community building within your library. Perhaps there's a shared project you might work on with someone that you don't know very well to see if you can start developing connections that way. Another thing you might do is at staff meetings, you can start with sharing something briefly before you start the meeting. And we call this an appreciative check-in, and I do this a lot in the meetings that I lead, and even my classes with my students, that before we start for the topic for the day, we go around and share one thing, like something I feel good about at my work, or something I'm looking forward to this weekend. Sometimes it's sharing what is your favorite thing to eat. So just small things like that, that you start to get to know people outside of your work setting, what's interesting to them, what motivates them, and who they are as people. And then another thing we can do when we want to develop relationships is really think about positive feedback. So when people are doing good things at work, we want to be recognized for that, but we often get busy and we don't take time to do that. And so things that we can think about with positive feedback, ideally it should be timely in that it should be close to the time when the good event or thing happens. It should be specific and detailed to give more description of what it is you feel thankful for or feel happy that the person has done. And it should really be genuine, that it's coming from your heart and that you really do feel that way. So instead of just saying, great job today, Amber, you could say, I really appreciated, even though you were busy, you took time to come over and talk to that patron who needed some extra help today. And I just wanted to let you know that I thought that that was really neat. And so you can just try to remember to notice when people do things and then express that gratitude. So I'd like you to think, what's one thing you appreciate that a colleague recently did? And you might write that down if you have an idea about that. And then have you shared this appreciation with them? So even though ideally our feedback should be timely and soon after something happens, it's never too late to say thank you or I appreciate you. So I would encourage you to share with your colleague. So what do we do when relationships seem stuck? So despite having effective, crucial conversations and despite spending time getting to know people, you might have some relationships that really don't seem to be getting better or that seem stuck. So 3 other ideas could be, first, take the Buddhist tradition and practice radical acceptance. It is what it is. It may not change, and so you can just try to accept that. You can also take a longitudinal perspective, so that first contemplative exercise we did together in this webinar, putting stressors into perspective, you can kind of think about that with our difficult relationships too, that this may be difficult now, but will it still be difficult a year from now, 5 years from now, when I retire? And that can help. And the last one is really thinking about and offering forgiveness. Maybe the relationship is stuck because of some past grievance that the person may have done. And there's a lot of literature on how the act of forgiveness can be healing for the person, for yourself who is giving the forgiveness. And you can do it in different ways. So one idea is to write a letter describing what happened and how you feel about it and the forgiveness part. And there are different delivery options. Some people do share it with the person, but many others find that doing some kind of a symbolic thing like burning it and letting it go to the universe or storing it away can feel good too. So there are different ideas for that. And on page 16, there's a place for you to think about if you're having difficulties with a particular relationship, some ideas that you might try to think about doing with that. And then we want to think a little bit about how do we gather social support. So in the health and coping literature, social support is a big area of helping people manage illness and wellness much better. And in the work environment, it's the same, that having people at work that you can share your joys and concerns with can be a big relief. And so there's a place on your toolkit on page 17, and I'd like you to think about writing down who is at least one person at your work that you can talk about your dreams and joys with and share your concerns. And there's a place in the toolkit that you can also write down if there's anything specific that they do that could be supporting or renewing for you. And I'd like you to think about one person outside of your workplace who could provide social support for you, that you might be able to talk to about your dreams and joys and your stresses or concerns related to your work. So on page 17, there are some other thought questions that can help you kind of think more deeply about other people who might help you. What is it you would like to do with your sources of social support? One thing that we do ourselves, my colleagues and I who work on this burnout prevention program, we call ourselves balance buddies. And so when we have our research meetings, we always start the research meeting with a 10-minute or so check-in about how things are going with our work-life balance issues, and just kind of touch base. And it just helps to know that every month when we have these calls, we'll be able to have a little bit of sharing time. And so I really encourage people to try to find at least one person that could be your balance buddy. Okay. So I think now we'll transition to another contemplative practice. And this is something that might help you not only relax and feel better, but also connect with other people. And it's a form of the Lovingkindness exercise. So it's another guided imagery exercise where we'll start with our deep breathing, and then I'll kind of walk you through some imagery to think about as you're doing your deep breathing. And so for this exercise, I'd like you to think about a source of loving kindness for you. So this might be it could be a spiritual source, a religious image or religious source, or it could be another person, either living or deceased, but someone that you feel brings you feelings of loving kindness. So think about who or what that image is for you, and then get into a comfortable position. And close your eyes if you can, if you're comfortable doing that, or if not, you can use the soft focus to relax your eyes. Take a few deep breaths, slowly breathing in and out with your diaphragm. Notice your breathing, how it sounds. Notice how your breathing feels as you're slowly taking deep breaths in and out. Now I'd like you to imagine your source of loving kindness. And let feelings of loving kindness be within you from whatever source you choose. Let that loving kindness surround you, suffuse you, and fill you. Let yourself feel nurtured. As you take your next breath, wish yourself well with feelings of happiness and well-being. You might say to yourself, "May I be filled with loving kindness." Now with your next breath, focus on that feeling of loving kindness and think about someone you love, someone you may want to share these feelings with. Say to yourself, "May feelings of loving kindness extend to you. May they be filled with loving kindness." Send them loving kindness as you wish that they experience love and acceptance and grow and be happy. Now think about someone who you are concerned about, someone who may be in need of extra loving kindness. As you call that person to mind, say to yourself, "May feelings of loving kindness extend from you to that person. May they be filled with loving kindness." So send them loving kindness as you wish that they experience love and acceptance and grow and be happy. Now come back to your own source of loving kindness and experience those feelings of loving kindness for you, replenishing you. Take another deep breath or two, feeling those feelings of happiness and well-being. And take another deep breath, and when you're ready, you can come and join us again. Okay, so on to the last portion of our webinar is really thinking about how do you put your plan in place. So there are things that you're probably already doing for your own wellness and renewal. And on page 18 is a place for you to think about what are the things you're currently doing and evaluating how are they working for you. Are they really helping to bring you renewal and well-being? And are you doing enough of them? So there's a place on page 18 where you could take a little time to evaluate those. And then you can think about some other activities that you could do for renewal. And there are some small ones that you can do very easily within your day. And there's some on page 19 that lists a whole bunch of them. A baker's dozen, he calls it, 13 of them. But one thing you might do is, for example, taking a daily intention on your trip to work. So taking time to turn off your radio or your podcast and say to yourself, what is one thing you want to do for yourself today? Another idea is your deep breathing. So we've done a lot of deep breathing exercises. Some of them only take a minute or two. And you might tie that with an activity you do regularly, like doing your deep breathing when your computer starts up. Or sometimes I do it when I come into the parking lot before I leave my car. So it's kind of a nice transition place for that. Remembering to see and greet the good when people are passing through the library doorway or when you are passing through the doorway yourself. That can be kind of a nice transition point as a reminder for you. Remembering your meaning and values when you pull down your emails. Sometimes we get so caught up in all of the tasks that we forget why we're here. And then taking some vitamin D breaks for the soul. Can you step outside the library? Can you focus on your breathing as you notice the sounds around you or the air in your face? And so some of those little things can make a big difference in your day. And at the end of your toolkit, there's a 2-page place for you to really plan for yourself. And I encourage you to take some time where you can think about some of the strategies we've talked about, other strategies you may be doing, and really make a plan for yourself. And then keep that plan somewhere where you can easily access it. So it's easy to go to a training, get your materials, and you put them in a folder and put them in the back of your desk, or I have a pile of stuff on one of my bookshelves from conferences I've gone to. But it's really only going to work if you keep it working for you. And you want to see how is it working for you. So on our first webinar, we did a little self-rating about our burnout level. And periodically you might want to check in with yourself. How am I doing with my burnout? And then tweak or revise your plan as needed. And so again, like with the other 2 webinars, I'd like you to think about what is one thing you want to do from today to incorporate in your life for the next week, and make a commitment to yourself. Write down what it is you want to do, and that goal ideally should be something specific and measurable, something you could achieve during this week, something that seems relevant or important for you and has some kind of time frame around it. So that is the end of my material, and I think we have a few minutes if people have some questions you want to type in. And then also I'm very happy to get emails, and we have a website and my phone too, so you can contact me for other questions and things too. Do we have any questions coming up?
No, we don't have any yet. I see that there are multiple people who are typing. A lot of positive feedback. I did want to do a little bit of housekeeping stuff. So all 3 of these sessions have been recorded, and I'm planning on putting them within an online asynchronous training. So please spread the word. By the middle of October, it should be going live, and everybody who attended at least one of these sessions, as well as the people who registered but didn't attend, will be receiving a link to be able to utilize that training. It'll include the toolkit, the videos, the slides, and hopefully we'll be able to help get the word out about this a little bit to a greater audience than the people who were able to attend. If there are no questions, thank you for attending, and thank you to Michelle especially.
That's great. I've really enjoyed doing these webinars, and I appreciate all of you taking the time to participate. And I've heard from several of you already through email, so it's really nice to hear from people.
And if this is a topic that you're very interested in, I know that somebody had asked if there are more new sessions like this that are going to be available. There is one that's coming up on mindfulness in the library, or more broadly, yoga in the library, and how yoga can be applied to increase mindfulness in your day-to-day lives, as well as in public programming. And that should actually be later in the month of October, so I think it's the last week of October. And you can register for that one through our eVanced calendar. I believe that there will also be another webinar coming up on just general stress and like stress management that'll be presented by the Purdue Extension Office. And then, of course, we will also be presenting this again for ILF on Wednesday, November 9th. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you for attending, and we're going to sign off.